Hi, I'm Jeff here at Orange Circle Farm in Berwick, Maine. We're practicing no-till market gardening here. The garden itself is about 1.5 acres. We've got about a little less than 1 acre in cash production every year. And I'm here with Becky from Tiny Roots Farm.
Hi, I'm Becky from Tiny Roots Organic Farm up in Litchfield, Maine. We are on a 3/4 acre no-till market garden, certified organic by MOFGA, and we do some southern Maine farmers markets.
And today we're going to be showing you around the garden, showing you a few different techniques, methodologies behind no-till, why we do it, how we do it, and the benefits of doing it.
Thanks for having me, Deer Farm. Just kind of wondering if you can kind of discuss what no-till is and why you do it.
Yeah, it's a little ambiguous, isn't it? Like no-till, it doesn't tell you what it is, it just tells you what it isn't. Ultimately what it is that we've chosen a path where we're not disturbing the soil by breaking up, usually coming in with a rototiller and like breaking up the soil. There's a lot of methods to kind of substitute for that or to use in place of that. You know, mulches, cover crops, different termination strategies where we're not like beating up the crops and beating up the soil, but instead we're kind of adding to it and covering up the weeds, and you know, we're not digging down, we're not bringing new weed seed up to the surface. So that helps to maintain our weed pressure through the year. It helps kind of build up the soil, the biodiversity within the soil. It helps with a lot of things. So as you're moving through a season of no-till growing, what are kind of the principles that keep you focused?
Soil health is super important, so disturbing the soil as little as possible. So like when a spinach crop is done, sort of using the stirrup hoe and just cutting it off right at the root soil, the structure, you know, right at the top. So allowing those microbes to kind of break down those roots and get fed and everything. Keeping it covered as much as possible, so either with a cover crop or a crop growing in there, and then as much as possible succession planting, so crops in there before the other ones come out, and keeping it covered and growing and staying healthy.
So don't disturb it, yes. Don't disturb the soil, keep it covered, yep. And keep it active.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Yep, sort of very important to have healthy soil. So what did you have here, Jeff?
So this was the summer squash and cucumber plot. Okay. It's early September now, so these have gone out of production, and now we're getting this set up to direct seed our cover crop for winter. It's kind of the same thing with like setting up for direct seeding. I know you do a lot more direct seeding of actual cash crops.
I do, yeah. Lots of greens and root crops are direct seeded. Do you use your hands or a machine for that? We
do have the direct seeder, so we need to be able to get through this without it binding up. So what we've done is rake off all of our mulch. In this case, it's cover crop debris from last year. So we've had it covered with and mulched with all of that debris. And so rake that off into the pathways, and that kind of cleans up the actual bed surface. There's a lot of flexibility in that. I mean, this is kind of the state of which you want your beds always, right? Like there's maximum flexibility here. You can add compost at this point, build up organic matter. You could just transplant into this, and you could also, seeding a cover crop, seeding a cash crop. This is kind of the blank slate. Like this is kind of as out of production as it ever gets. Yeah. But this is only, a week of the year. And this can happen, like the turnover for this can be a day. Like that's kind of the cool part.
And how many times a year do you turn over each plot?
A lot of our plots, we're just kind of having one transition. So you start with a cover crop, or you start with a mulch that has died over winter, and then you plant into it, and then that comes out of production. A couple of plots will make more sense. If you have radishes or you have quick greens. I know you do a lot of quick greens.
Yeah. So a lot of my plots will actually have sometimes 3 to 6 crops in them. Spinach and stuff is like a 26-day crop, and then pull it out the following week and plant something else right back into it.
Yeah. And that's one of the benefits of the no-till, is that you can have those quick turnarounds because you're not waiting for to be able to run a tractor through it and wait for all the weeds and stuff to break down. The weeds aren't there to begin with.
Yeah, and then you don't have that nitrogen tying up when all the crop is, turned back into the ground. There's those few weeks of like not being able to plant because all the nutrients are being absorbed from the breakdown of the material you've tilled in.
Yeah. One of the things we've also found very helpful is getting into the beds in the spring. Like you don't need to wait to be able to get the tractor in to get that mechanical tillage involved. You're just, at best, you've got wheelbarrows that need to dump some compost in, but you can really get in there so you can get in there earlier, but also like more predictably. I know for a CSA, we kind of have a schedule that we'd like to stick to. So.
Yeah, we definitely are in the beds. Like this year I was in the beds in March. I just pulled back the straw. Some of my beds are in cash crops until November, so they can't be anymore. And then they get covered in straw. So in the spring, just go out and uncover the beds and in go the seeds.
Yeah. So you can see how easily these leeks will pull out. We did do a dibble to get them so they have the long blanched part. These do come up pretty easily, even though they are that deep in the ground. Root crops are actually the easiest ones to turn around. Like, you don't even have to come in and deal with any debris after. You're pulling up the debris and you're harvesting it. So these beds afterwards are ready for a cover crop. They're ready for the next transplanted thing, the next
do you find that you put any sort of nutrients down in between, or do you just that one apply of compost in the spring or fall is good enough?
Most of the time we end up having to add in additional nutrients to get it to produce a full next crop. If it's a light feeder early on, like maybe it's just a quick crop of radishes or something, we might not need to add anything for another. But especially for leeks that are in the ground for a bit longer, they might be taking a lot with them once we pull them out. So, but then you end up with these beautiful leeks. So this will all come out of production in time for us to get our overwintering cover crop of rye and clover in here. So for us in southern Maine, that's going to be end of September. We need to be out of this field and have it seeded to a cover crop. Beyond that, we kind of risk not having that cover crop really make it through the winter, or not having it provide coverage through the winter. Yeah. So as part of that kind of keeping your soil active and keeping it covered, we'd definitely be missing out on keeping it covered if we didn't have it established in time. We irrigate in a couple of different ways. Some of our crops are on drip, some of ours are on overhead, and the plots move around each year, so we decided to actually have each plot have its own segment of a header. So for instance, this is the beginning of a header, and we just have these cam lock couplings, so we can undo this. So for our winter squash patch, for instance, we know we just want one line of drip running down. So we just have one emitter per bed, as opposed to over here for our nightshades, we know we want to have two because there's more dense planting. So that's set up with 2 headers per bed. But then if the nightshade crop, that moves to the other side of the garden, next year we can just move this header over there, and that helps us to kind of...
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of set up for your whole farm every year. You're not redoing it every year, or this bed needs 1 line, that needs 2, that needs 4, that. And
one of the reasons you get into no-till is because of the lack of mechanization. You don't have all the big equipment to do a lot of the digging, to like bury all the infrastructure and do all of those things. There's kind of this light footprint that's associated with it. So having these above the ground and being able to move them year to year, depending on our needs, like that just kind of matches the amount of infrastructure that we have and the equipment that we have. So this isn't necessarily linear, but you can see this is one of our plots that we had in oats and peas, and then we rolled it down just to be able to then put a tarp on top of it. And the tarp actually kills it. The rolling it down, that doesn't necessarily kill it. But then after, depending on the time of the year, so maybe 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even shorter in the peak summer, but around the edges of the season, it'll take a little longer. It'll kill it, and then you have this kind of mulch to work with. So if you're transplanting, you could go straight through this, and that's fine. If you wanted to direct seed, like a cover crop or some of your greens, for instance, we could just rake all of this cover crop debris out into the pathways, and then you have a seed bed. So we would just, yeah. So you can see how it rolls it down, and then we bring the tarp over here because it doesn't kill this just to knock it over. So with cover crops, it's kind of, you have the overwintering cover crops, your rye, clovers, those things that will survive through one of these New England winters and then come up next spring, which is great as long as you don't need those beds early in the spring. Do you do a lot of like early spring planting? I
do, yeah. I try and do at least one plot where I can have that overwintered cover crop for that sort of photosynthesis first in the spring.
So what goes in after an overwintered cover crop?
So after an overwintered one, we will sort of crimp it and tarp it, probably mid-June, depending upon the year. And then in that fall, just kind of use that as a transplanting. So for lettuces, onions, we grow a little bit of brassicas as far as broccoli and stuff for ourselves.
Yeah, so this is where we're growing fall brassicas in this plot this year. This was a cover crop of rye and clover, crimson clover, and then it got rolled down, and for us it's late May, and then we covered it with a tarp, and then obviously that's going to kill any of the weeds that might have survived along with the rye. And then we come in, we know we're not going to be able to get a cover crop in after we're not going to be able to have it actively growing through the winter, because we'll harvest all of these things and then it'll be too late to get established. So we like that we do have at least some coverage, some protection for that soil through the winter. And then next year we can come in early, rake out that leftover cover crop debris, and we can get into these beds really early.
Do you have any reason for doing I know that the clover will fixate nitrogen in the soil, but do you have any reason for doing the clover over the winter rye and like wanting to chop it down and use it as a mulch later on? I
think there's a level of diversity inside, like, if every plot we have has rye every year, like we want to try to diversify our vocabulary, and all of the crops are on a different schedule, so if we can, ultimately they're kind of doing a similar thing. It's keeping the soil active, it's growing. There's different nutrient capabilities within each one of them. They have different root systems, different biomasses. Today we've shown you a few methods for getting involved with no-till. This is just a few methods. There's a lot of different ways. Obviously we've talked about, no-till. It doesn't prescribe any particular method. It just means that we're kind of sticking with those three factors, just not disturbing the soil as much as possible, keeping the soil covered as much as possible, and keeping the soil actively growing as much as possible. Inside of that, there's a lot of wiggle room. We've kind of shown you how we do it here. Becky's talked some about how she's doing it. There's a lot of different resources out there to cover no-till practices on the MOFGA website. The internet's full of them. Just the idea of no-till is kind of a good organizational tool to be able to search for those practices and techniques. But in the end, we're really just kind of synthesizing some of those things to your specific context, to what context you're working inside of, what works for you, what your markets are. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is focus on the longevity of these spaces. It doesn't take a lot to get a no-till operation up and running in terms of equipment. Like, you don't need a big plot of land. The space is pretty minimal. It's a very efficient use of space. The infrastructure involved is pretty minimal.
I think that sort of the small scale urban farms are definitely what's going to support the local community in the future. The supply of food chains traveling all across the world is not very economic. So I think for us, keeping it small and keeping it productive and sort of high turnover is really important.
Having the MOFGA certification alongside the no-till parameters that we're working inside of kind of helps to further define the practices that we are using here on the farm. So thanks for watching. Hope you've learned something that you can use in your own gardening practices and join the no-till community.
Yeah, thanks for watching.